Well, Tatiana, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Look, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here. So starting off with first question is around Europe versus the US. Is Europe at a big competitive disadvantage right now?
I think that's a big question. And it's definitely one that's been top of mind for me. I've just come back from a trip on the West Coast where a lot of the conversation was around essentially seeing these trillion-dollar giants dominating the market and having investors in a complete paralysis over whether it's worth investing in anything apart from the foundation labs. And I think even like a macro point around everyone is paralyzed by not knowing what the future looks like. I think it's becoming increasingly, there's a hysteria around how people are thinking about what the future of work looks like, for example. And ultimately, investors are paralyzed by thinking through what sectors can AI intercept and essentially just completely cannibalize companies that even a couple of years ago were thriving. And I think the sentiment is shifting increasingly towards investing in hardware, defensible moat companies as much as possible. And I think actually that's a place where medtech, of course, really thrives. Coming back to that divide between US and Europe, I think I'll include UK within Europe for this context, but I find myself looking over the pond and thinking about how we can continue to stay competitive with a market that just moves at a completely different cadence. But I'd caveat, it's ultimately for better or for worse, right? I think there are definitely segments and sectors that you want to invest in where you want to be moving as fast as possible, for sure. But there can be a degree of recklessness that comes with that. And I think if you're investing in ultimately defensible, highly regulated sectors like healthcare, more specifically medtech, Europe still has an advantage. I think especially from a perspective where Europe is still a reasonably cheap place to be running R&D. So we see a number of our companies who, despite thinking about that US go-to-market, and ultimately that is where the venture math works, that's where the big market is, but still maintaining that R&D hub within Europe because you can be more capital efficient, you can hire and scale at least workforce and R&D engineering within that setting that then makes the economics make sense. I think broader theme for this discussion probably will be comparing US and Europe almost constantly. And I think it's honestly on the back of everyone's mind at the moment in the venture community.
Does every company that's building in Europe need to have a primary focus on the US? I was sat down with Tom Rash from Early Bird Ventures. He was saying, unless you have an FDA strategy and unless you have a US go-to-market, then I'm not even going to look at it. Do you feel the same sentiment?
I hate to say it, but yes, unfortunately. Yeah, it all comes back down to that R&D point of the UK, for example, is a really good place to start building businesses, gathering data. For example, more broadly in healthcare, we benefit in the UK from the NHS, which ultimately means that every single patient individual has a single number that's attributed to their name. And it means that you can follow them for a lifetime. So there's a lot of data that you can gather from people in a single health system that we do have in the UK. And I think you can leverage that to build really exciting products that you can expand them a bit within the UK. I think, unfortunately, it just comes back to venture math, right? It only makes sense if you're scaling in the US. And I'd say that's the way that we think about building businesses, is ultimately using the UK as a launch pad, using all of the exciting data that we can leverage to build excellent products that ultimately can have a place in the UK market, but they have to go to the US at some point.
For sure. So to give the audience some context on who you are, like what did you study? Like, how did you get into this game and how did you get interested in the world of medtech?
I studied neuroscience in what feels like a very long time ago now, but actually it wasn't too long ago. And really from the outset, what I'm more broadly motivated by is translational science. I think neuroscience was a natural vertical for me because ultimately the brain remains one of the most complex things in the universe. And I think it's just one puzzle piece of the broader human body, which, ultimately is a huge different problems to be solved. And I think that's why in general medicine is just so exciting and healthcare is such an interesting space to be in. So that was my starting point. And I realized fairly quickly that working in the lab wasn't necessarily for me. But actually, there were so many different ways that I could leverage my scientific knowledge to be working in adjacent industries. And I think that's remained consistent. I've always maintained a healthcare specialism, and it's through that translational interest and ultimately patient impact at the end of the day. Post studying, I then went to what I like to call the dark side, but someone reminded me that the true dark side would be a hedge fund. But I worked in healthcare investment banking for the best part of about 4 years, most of which I was working with Rothschild in London as part of their healthcare M&A team. And essentially, I was working across a number of different verticals across biotech, medtech, healthcare services. I found myself gravitating very much towards the more innovative, again, like translational side of the deals that I was working on. And I think I had the benefit of the scientific background as well to be able to translate and contextualize what a lot of these businesses were doing. And I think that investment banking background and training gave me then a good stance to where I am today as an investor to always be thinking about exits and like ultimately be incredibly process driven and quantitatively driven. Worked on a number of really interesting deals whilst I was there. One of which was the BTG Boston Scientific transaction. Really interesting company, and we were supporting on the sell side, but that was really kind of a UK poster child for medtech. So it was interesting to see it be acquired by Boston Scientific, obviously a huge giant in the space. And I think continues to give a lot of validation for strong UK companies that you can build. And then following investment banking, I thought I'd try my hand at the other side of the table. So I joined a biotech company who were basically working in the neuropsychiatric space in psychedelics. So I joined in 2021, which was part of the quote-unquote shroom boom, where basically there was a huge influx of capital into the space. I think a lot of different themes saw this. Ultimately, there was a lot of excitement around parts of healthcare within 2021, and psychedelics benefited from that. Worked with them on the proof of concept phase 2A study that they were working on in major depressive disorder patients. It was really interesting, I think, being on that other side of the table, actually seeing how a company works. I think often, it's not necessarily a negative, but often when you're working on the advisory side, you're pretty much just exposed to the board and then very high-level C-suite of often what are quite mature companies. And you're part of that kind of value realization phase, as opposed to all the value creation that happens across the life cycle of a company. So it was incredibly illuminating. Really enjoyed my time there. And then I moved to another seat around the table where now I've been an investor at OSC for 3 years. Ultimately, again, it's trying to take all my experiences from the advisory capacity of thinking through, like, ultimately, how can you realize value in a company to the company building and creation part of like actually working hands-on within a startup, then to the investor where you get one of the favorite parts of my job is the variety of different things that you get to look at and you get to invest in and be part of their story. Really, what I've been doing over the past 3 years is continuing to build on that very early stage company exposure, trying to think about ways to create value, but then marrying it with that banker hat of how do you ultimately realize value? Because ultimately that's what venture capital is about. But yeah, and I can give a bit more context about OSC or Oxford Science Enterprises. Essentially, they are a UK based investment company where we're fully independent from the University of Oxford, but we have a very strong relationship with them. And part of the thesis is that ultimately world-leading science is coming out of these university ecosystems. And how do we best extract that and build businesses from that? OSC currently has, I think it's 1.3 billion under management. So we've got a meaningful amount of capital. We invest off balance sheet as well. So not a classic fund structure where it's, you have to invest across 10 years. It's ultimately long-term patient capital. I'm an investor in the health tech team. What we call health tech is basically everything that sits outside of therapeutics. So incredibly broad mandate, but it means that we essentially look at diagnostics, life science tools, classical digital health, tech-enabled services, and then my favorite, medtech and med devices, where I've been increasingly focusing over the past year and a half, I'd say. What I enjoy about medtech is coming from more of a perhaps biotech world and marrying the two, where ultimately you're focusing on highly clinically validated technologies. They're patient adjacent, and you can see them working live with helping patients' lives, which is incredibly important to me. And it's also that data-driven piece, right? And you also sit under the same regulator. So I feel like it's a common framework that I've been able to think across my various experiences to where I've got here. But yeah, I absolutely love it. I think it's a dynamic industry. I think there's a lot of interesting trends that continue to emerge. And part of the joy of venture building within the Oxford ecosystem is really being able to take that theme first approach on thinking about how you want to build a company. So for example, if you see that it's increasing kind of heat that's coming from a given vertical, like say structural heart or neurovascular, taking a proactive approach of thinking about how can we build a business in this space that ultimately we know can deliver the return that we want, but also make an incredibly meaningful unmet clinical impact.
That's awesome. So you mentioned that patient capital a couple of times in there. So
Yeah.
with patient capital, how is OSCE actually kind of measuring that? What does that actually look like in terms of like how you actually measure that?
Do you mean in the sense of how we like? Is it more like a capital deployment
So
question, or you mean like a patient impact question?
patient impacts question.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think probably less of a proactive measurement, but more of like a investment mandate to ensure that we're really investing in technologies that can impact patients' lives rather than be something that's supplemental or perhaps non-core in any way. And I think often, it's not always the case, but often a technology that's driven by patient impact will also have the biggest TAM ultimately. It's not always the case, but it can be a key part of it. So it's always maintaining that at the core of how you think about any investment thesis, is really thinking about, well, not only does the market want to, can we create something here, but ultimately will it improve people's lives?
Okay. So at the stage you get involved with companies, it's usually when they're at their kind of most immature, if you will. They're just coming out of academia and they're just... So how does that selection process work? How do you spot technologies which actually can go the distance versus technologies which I guess just might fall a lot flat?
Well, this is a blanket statement, but a lot of things that one can see in the ecosystem is a technology that's been built, but perhaps without an unmet clinical need in mind. So I think that's a very common pitfall and something that where we would want to see that, like, actually, is there a market pull? Is there an unmet clinical need that you're trying to address? And then work it back from there on, and your solution is. So I think that's like actually one of the most fundamental things that we see. It's often in med devices or med tech, you might see more of a tech push as opposed to like a clinical pull. So it's always making sure that the horse is before the cart, not the other way around. I'd say that's probably one of the the most common things that we see from that early company creation point. And part of that really that we've tried to, I suppose, resolve for that is we have an interesting entrepreneur in residence model where we have former entrepreneurs who have, in many cases, successfully exited businesses, or they have a previous career in entrepreneurship. They're ultimately looking to cut their teeth on the next building 0 to 1, which I must say is an incredibly difficult thing to do. So honestly, they're a supreme bunch of folk. And part of that exercise, as they're starting to think about the art of the possible of what you could build in a company, or how you could work with an academic, is thinking through first clinical unmet need, and then trying to work out how a technology that sits with the university might fit within that, and that an academic might want to work together to ultimately, again, bring that to patients, the ultimate goal.
So EIR, or entrepreneur in residence, isn't necessarily kind of a new concept out there, but how is yours unique? You mentioned there was a couple of things.
Yeah, so I think, I think ours are unique in the sense that they're essentially planted within an incredibly rich ecosystem of where there is existing IP, emerging IP. So it's not necessarily starting from a completely blank sheet of paper. Although, to my previous point, we still encourage them to be thinking about that kind of blank, where does true unmet needs sit? But I think that's where the perfect marriage can happen, where it's like, okay, I have this really neat idea how we can solve a therapy for this specific disease. More often than not, there will be an academic who works within our ecosystem who is world-leading expert in said disease and has been thinking about a solution within this, as opposed to other EIR models where it might be that you've been set with this blank sheet of paper, you've identified an unmet need, you're starting to build a company, but you're still trying to find the expertise or the solution that fits within that. So I think that's one of the key differentiators, and I think ultimately something that also makes us an attractive partner for prospective entrepreneurs and residents to come work with us.
Identified a clear unmet clinical need, potentially have the entrepreneur in residence. What does that experience look like for a company or technology once you get a hold of it and deploy that first check?
Interesting. So I think we like to be quite hands-on investors, and that goes hand in hand with venture building. So ultimately, so post first check, a lot of investors would be like, see you later. We'll come back for the next board meeting, say that you haven't tracked your progress and be upset about it. We like to be more involved, not in an overbearing sense at all, but more in what ways can we strategically leverage our network to be able to get you the right advice to start building out a clinical roadmap, or it might be find the right technical partners for you to start thinking about your initial product design. We've had in a couple of cases where there's a great CRO that we've worked with often on, good first in human in Europe. And ultimately, we've now got a good relationship with them where we say, like, this is an excellent site, work with these guys. So I think it's having people who have that network within us as an investment team and being able to leverage that as much as possible, and ultimately having thought leadership. I think I would say a number of different investors offer that thought leadership as well. But I think wherever we can offer a unique perspective or just ensure that, and again, ultimately it's also protecting our investment as well, right? Of trying to be as helpful as possible. So it's really just trying to construct and build together. And then, hopefully you can let them fly off and into success. But yeah, I'd say those are probably the cornerstones of how we think about it.
I want to take a minute to say thank you to our sponsors, TTP. TTP is a leader in complex medical device development. With deep scientific and engineering expertise, they help medtech teams crack tough development challenges and make the right calls early, reducing rework, delays, and uncertainty later on. Whether you're navigating uncharted technical territory or racing towards market, TTP brings clarity and real-world judgment to the decisions that shape performance, usability, and manufacturability. By retiring risk early and grounding innovation in real-world constraints, they help you move forward with speed and confidence. To find out more, check out the show notes.
So from what you're seeing at the moment, what are some of the most exciting areas that are coming through?
Actually, interestingly, coming back to the investment banker experience, tending to think about like where are strategics particularly acquisitive? I think ultimately medtech benefits from having, a select number of giants in the space and who clearly put their marks in the ground of where they would like to build out their franchise. So, for example, we think actively about building in structural heart, as I've mentioned, and we're thinking actively about building in that space. Another space, for example, is within neurovascular that I mentioned earlier, top of mind. But ultimately, that's spurred by seeing Boston Scientific acquire Penumbra earlier this year, and then also seeing ultimately Medtronic trying to catch up in different spaces. So you know that there will be a couple of different players once you get all the way through to the finish line who would be interested in driving something that could be really exciting and competitive. So it's trying to take a bit of that approach. And we tried to speak with strategics to get a better understanding of how they're thinking about the landscape. And ultimately, also not being too prescriptive of exactly what they've just acquired, because sometimes a strategic will just completely reach their arm out and decide that they want to build in a completely new sector. So I think it's trying to stay close to the market as much as possible, and ultimately thinking also with the Oxford hat, where does Oxford have a right to win? So, for example, cardiovascular medicine is a huge hotspot within the ecosystem. So almost certainly there's talent that would be able to help us build a company in that space. So it's trying to be somewhat proactive in that respect.
So on the kind of talent side, like how rich is that Oxford ecosystem beyond academia?
And I think extending beyond just Oxford as well, maybe like more broadly UK, there's a good talent pool, but ultimately, if you're looking to build a business that's going to scale in the US, a lot of it is thinking about ultimately that US talent pool. And it comes back to kind of the European point as well, of where I'm not saying it's always the case, but often strong UK or European talent eventually moves over to the US. So sometimes there can be a bit of a brain drain from that perspective. And that's also where trying to work out Europe's right to win can feel a bit uncomfortable. Ultimately, the way that we like to think about it, because we're building for that end market, is trying to get, occasionally it's optimizing for, excellent talent, no matter where they are. Often that happens to be in the US, but it will also just be people who have a strong track record of successfully building companies, hopefully exiting them, and us being able to have that faith that these people, it's ultimately not people's first time at the rodeo, because you're putting a lot of capital and faith in them to be able to execute. And I think from my perspective, and I think a lot of people share this, especially in medtech, often companies don't die in R&D, they die in commercial.
Mm-hmm.
So it's optimizing for those US commercial leaders as early as possible, really, to enrich that for the talent that we try to bring into companies.
Sure. And how do you build for those commercial leaders?
We think that the offering that we have in Oxford is compelling, that ultimately if an exec, wherever they are, but let's say from the US, if an exec can be part of the journey right from the beginning, be part of what the vision is for a really exciting company built in this space, we think that's an incredibly compelling proposition to be part of that kind of 0 to 1 to 100 journey. I think sometimes we like to frame it as you're taking a sabbatical in Oxford, right? Because ultimately you might only end up in that geographic location for, say, 2 to 3 years. And then, by the time that you're starting to think about, your bigger trial designs and building relationships with KOLs that ultimately in the US, and they kind of can move back over the pond. So it's really trying to think and optimize for that. But, it's a competitive talent market. So really, I think wherever you can differentiate with a company that's built on strong science, people are really supportive of that, as opposed to, occasionally just starting with a complete blank sheet, which also might attract a different talent pool.
Sure. And with that, do you ever find that those leaders become disengaged at all in that time period? Because the commercial leaders that have taken it from 10 to 100 and plus, they typically really enjoy that commercial phase. So coming back into the R&D stages where you have to deal with the engineering challenges through clinical, through regulatory, through quality. Do you ever find there's like disengagement, or how do you keep people engaged if they do get disengaged?
That's interesting. And I think it depends on the type of company that you're looking to build. I think ultimately a lot of that R&D phase and initial like optimization of the product and the ultimate device itself, because it needs to have that commercial endpoint and it needs to have that input as soon as possible. It's really just bringing everyone into the room to be able to engage in that conversation altogether. I think it's important in organizations not to have silos. So I think that's one factor. And then to some extent, it's also perhaps in economic terms where it's thinking about you're part of this long-term journey with us. Your skills will really be leveraged at X point, but we'd like you to help with this early building. Like, how can we incentivize you best to think about that? But that's more from the company building perspective. Sometimes I think ultimately, if you don't necessarily need to leverage people 100% of the time as well, you can just engage them as advisors around the table who, again, can embrace that thought leadership with an earlier R&D team, but making sure that commercial is always on their radar. Because I think that's a consideration that often companies don't really think about as early as possible. I was reading that apparently within medtech, for companies that get FDA approval, 75% of them then fail in commercial, which is crazy. So again, it's like if you can front load all of those decisions earlier, front load that risk, you also keep investors happy. But that's probably the best way to think about it.
Sure. I think they call it the valley of death, that period between
Absolutely.
it. So let's dive into some of the kind of things that are really succeeding at the moment. So I know that Amber recently obviously did quite a successful raise with great investors, but talk to me about some of the kind of current portfolios that are really starting to do some incredible things.
We have a variety of different things within the portfolio. So we've got a company within the life science tool space, Refine, which is really picking up traction and growth. I'd say that's a company that's one to watch. It's really exciting. It's on the later stage. And then progressing through, we have a couple of companies in the AI diagnostic space, actually both within cardiology, but both with very different offerings. So we have Ultromics, for example, which is focusing more on HEPF. And then a company that I'm closer to is Caristo. So essentially, it's an AI diagnostic leveraging CCTA for detection of inflammation, which is hypothesized to be a better predictor for cardiac events. So incredibly powerful in a clinical setting. And that's a company that's looking to grow and scale in the US. So definitely one to watch and one that I'm incredibly excited by. And then there are a couple of other companies that I'm close to. One within the neuromodulation space. It's a company in stealth, so I can't disclose exactly what indication it's working in. But actually coming back to the active thesis building, neuromodulation has been one that I've been fleshing out for a long time. I still think there are a number of really exciting different targets and different disease areas that one could be moving into. I think there's definitely space for both invasive and non-invasive in the market. And I think it completely depends on your end user or patient at the end of the day. But yeah, the Neuromod company I'm really excited by and hopefully we'll look to launch it more publicly soon.
So yeah, just to dive a little bit deeper, I know that Caristo is one of those that you're really excited about. So tell me a little bit more about that company.
Yeah, absolutely. So Caristo Diagnostics is an Oxford science led company that's basically built off the backbone of godfathers in cardiology within the ecosystem. So basically, I think the reason why they're incredibly exciting is they're playing in a market where typically for coronary artery disease, for example, a physician will look at your CCTA and ultimately decide whether you've got plaque or stenosis, and they'll determine whether you're going to have a cardiac event off the back of that. Now, with Caristo, they have an algorithm that essentially detects inflammation, which they've published extensively to show is an extremely strong predictor for whether you'll have a cardiac event. So incredibly meaningful for identifying those patients incredibly on and potentially intervening within their treatment plan in a more effective way.
So what do you think dictates those winners versus some there's obviously always in VC, there's winners, there's ones that unfortunately don't make it. So what's been dictating the ones that are kind of standing out and really gaining traction versus ones that have maybe fallen by the wayside a bit?
Coming back to that early commercial thinking as soon as possible, I think those are the ones that are and continue to be successful. So I think the companies that have basically started thinking about the US end market as soon as possible. So we've definitely seen that with a couple of our portfolio companies where whether it's bringing on US talent or people who just have experience building and scaling in the US. I think the talent pool is different from the people who have grown from 10 to 100 versus the people who have actually started at zero revenue and have to actively work out how to map out the key sites that you should be building at and ultimately how fragmented your market will be. So that 0 to 1 to 10 is where it's quite exciting. And I think we've got quite a few companies that sit within that space. And I'd say it's all been about bringing that talent on and that advice around the table to really be thinking about it in a strategic rather than tactical way. So, and it's always having that US kind of mentality first for ultimately achieving scale and building businesses that we're excited about.
And we talked about this US side a lot. I know it's top of mind because you've just been to the US,
Yeah.
but how does the US VC network actually view kind of the Oxford ecosystem and even Europe? Like, are they really excited by this? Is it something which they have just US eyes on? Like, tell me more about that.
It depends on sector ultimately. But I'd say Oxford continues to have somewhat of a halo around it. I think it's worldwide known as the top research university, and people in the US continue to see that. Part of a US right to win is very much an ecosystem where they move quickly and break things. And it comes back to that kind of divide between US, Europe. I think in more academic ecosystems, there's a perception from the US that they're slower moving, and perhaps that's a broader effect that we see, within this space. I wouldn't say it's, too far from the truth, but at the same time, I think, moving fast and breaking things works for certain sectors, absolutely. I don't think it works for medtech, for example, where ultimately you need to be lean, mean, move quickly, but at the same time, it's a highly regulated industry, and ultimately you're building for fidelity in a device that's going to be potentially implanted into patients. So moving quickly and breaking stuff just doesn't work.
And honestly, that US side at the moment, like we obviously do quite a lot of work around the world, Europe, US, everything like that. I think it very much depends on the organization in Europe. There are some incredible businesses that can move incredibly quickly in Europe. But when it comes to commercial, when you need to grow up and put the kind of commercial shoes on, the US is really the place where those aggressive scaling companies need to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
So on the kind of European topic, a little bit deeper, what does Europe need to do better to make it a more attractive place to build a medical technology company?
Founders ultimately in Europe continue to have that intrinsic drive and motivation to be able to build something that's incredibly ambitious. I think more flexibility in the infrastructure to let them do that. Again, they're not moving fast and breaking stuff, but they want to build stuff at a reasonable pace. I think that's part of the equation. And part of it is something that you see in the US is ultimately a lot of healthcare infrastructure is already slightly commercially minded. So, for example, a given surgeon in the US will understand the throughput of, a sales rep coming to them, ultimately looking to sell one of the devices, like what that commercially means for them. I think incentive structures are incredibly different in Europe. That can ultimately lead to a lag in gathering data, gaining adoption, and all of these things that continue to, I guess, increase that valley of value that happens between Europe and US. So I think just some improvement in the infrastructure to be able to allow that, because I think there are a lot of really exciting and motivated people that we have, particularly in the UK. But if you continue to hit up against walls, then I can understand it. Things like ultimately move at a much slower cadence, and it's hard to then stay competitive in the broader world.
So you talked a little bit about those walls that exist in Europe.
Yeah.
What are a few of those walls that are blocking entrepreneurs now?
So I actually think one of them potentially is capital. So a lot of European investors, UK investors included, are again seeing the value that's being built in the US market more generally, and that ultimately leads to a bit of a gap in terms of trying to, if you're a UK or European founder, trying to get the right people around the table and the right investors, especially in a more capital constrained environment, which we've been living in for the past couple of years. I think the market's starting to bounce back a bit, but that's often one where I've encountered companies that have good data, good leadership team, good plans for the future, but ultimately I'm looking at so many other things at the same time. It's hard to be able to weigh up all those different options, and the caliber just keeps on increasing. So I think from a founder-led perspective, that's probably one of the key ones. And I think the second one is probably around talent as well. So it's finding people who are willing to get their hands dirty. Those people are everywhere, and they're always really excited to get stuck in with an early med devices business. But again, it's thinking about that potential brain drain of people from who perhaps get a bit frustrated here in Europe, UK, and then decide that actually looking at greener pastures in the US is more compelling to them. So it's being able to not only, I suppose, hire people, but also retain good talent can sometimes be a factor. And also on the talent piece, especially when you're investing so early, it's about people who are willing to take that risk of essentially starting from that blank sheet of paper and then, some cool science that's happening, meshing those together, not knowing what the future looks like. I think also as a factor of a capital constrained environment, people are just slightly more risk averse. So I've encountered, companies who are saying, it is difficult to find people who want to take that really early stage risk.
Okay, so I'm going to take this conversation back to one of the things that was kind of bugging me earlier, when you're very close to early stage and you're also very close to strategics. And so if you're an early stage person building for those strategics, where are people going wrong and where are people getting it really right?
Maybe if we look at what a strategic wants to see. So I think you'll see that a lot of strategics actually, it's a buyer's market. So they have the luxury of being able to set the bar and set the tone of what they want to acquire. And often that's a company in a category defining space that has an opportunity to really own a significant part of the market. That's ideally a company that has FDA approval, but then also early commercial traction. But then the moment that you start to put early commercial traction on the map, there's a revenue multiple that you can then quickly tie. So I think it's a buyer's market in that sense, but it gives you a roadmap to what you think a great company looks like that they're potentially really excited by, and that's also what matters from an investment perspective. So if you take all of that in mind for then what you're building in an early stage company, is how early can we make that company look like ultimately what the strategics would be interested in. So that's building a roadmap all the way through to an FDA approved product, what early, good commercial adoption would look like, incredibly strong clinical data, and potentially a pipeline of different products that could quickly dovetail off. So it's being able to set up from day dot rather than kind of like fumble around in the jungle. So it's those, they seem like incredibly far away points, but actually the earlier and earlier you think about the end result is what defines the great businesses from the good businesses. I think there are a lot of companies that, through no fault of their own, are ultimately learning along the way, and they're not necessarily thinking about that really attractive end market of what makes them great versus good. So that's where I wouldn't say it's necessarily a pitfall on their behalf, but ultimately, as an investor as well, you're trying to think of the most capital efficient way to get from A to B.
Sure. And does every company need to build with a dual track of acquired or go to market and be a standalone company?
That's a fair point. I think so. Well, I guess the third one is public markets, like an IPO. I think those are three letters that we have not heard in Europe for quite a while. And again, seeing the buoyancy of what's happening over the pond, it'd be interesting to think through whether that will start to emerge within medtech as an attractive end market. And I think there are quite a few European companies who a while ago went public perhaps a bit prematurely and haven't necessarily seen the benefit come across. And I think that's why investors have also been a bit shy about introducing that third track. But I think ultimately the plan should always be to build that really strong standalone business, being able to, stand alone on your 2 feet and really try and own as much as you can from the market. The only thing is expensive, right? So even talking about that kind of buyer's market and strategic point of view, even getting to FDA approval and early commercial traction, like businesses that are building, have to start building sales forces, having to think really strategically about how to not just burn a lot of capital by having millions of sales reps trying to create a market. It's incredibly difficult. Ultimately, it's a whole risk-reward thing, not only from an investment perspective, but also from a company perspective of thinking about, and a time value of money like perspective as well, of thinking about ultimately, do we feel like we can get the best value for this business as a standalone where we have the commercial chops to be able to build out that market? Or actually, could we benefit from working being acquired by a strategic, but they already have that infrastructure. That means that it's much easier to roll out. And then fundamentally, if your end vision is getting to patients and improving people's lives, then you want that to be able to achieve at scale. It doesn't necessarily matter whose name it's under at the end of the day. It feels incredibly binary, but at the same time, I come with a biased view where it's like, we want to build great businesses, but we also want to be able to see a return from them. So it depends in what forum.
Sure. And so in this kind of market scenario, it's very much an oligopoly with many different strategics and many different kind of acquiring parties. Are they ready for the digital and AI tools that are coming through? And are they really ready to integrate these new technologies into their businesses?
I think that's a great question. I would love to unpick that further and see, even just pick up on whether these guys are even talking about it in their earnings transcripts. Because I think coming back to the initial point around like hardware businesses will be the most defensible in a world where, there's the SaaS apocalypse where software can kind of like overreach, and essentially you could have these foundation labs cannibalizing so many different businesses. Hardware continues to have that defensible moat around it. Like I do wonder if the giants within MedTech are thinking about how can we start to be, I don't want to say progressive, but start to move a bit with the market. And I think it's also slightly an investor signaling point at the same time as well, because ultimately there are a lot of investors out there who invest across, they might be generalists, but invest across a number of different verticals. And they might shy away from sectors like medtech because it hasn't got the sexy word of AI within it. So it would be interesting to see how they think about that strategically from that investor perspective, but also start to identify where there are areas of unmet need that AI could be augmenting their platforms. For example, I can appreciate within the surgical robotics space, like that definitely seems ripe for further disruption with AI. There are a number of different platforms that really could be augmented by a tool like AI. Similarly, thinking through devices and increasingly seeing both, monitoring as well as a closed loop mechanism. Like there must be kind of some way that we can integrate a slightly more intelligent system that isn't too energy intensive and isn't too capital intensive either. But yeah, I'd be really interested to dig into that further.
For sure. So to kind of bring the kind of conversation towards a close, like, is there anything you want to share about OSE or the work you're doing that the audience needs to hear about?
It's really driving home the point around being an exciting venture builder who believes in world-leading science that's coming from the UK. But I think something that we continue to excel in, and that comes through from Nobel Prize winners we have from the UK, and the supreme amounts of innovation in science. I think it's so ripe for translation and building really exciting businesses from that. And I think part of OSC's mandate is really thinking about how we can extract that value. Our CEO often says that he thinks that the next $1 trillion company will come from a university ecosystem like Oxford. So I think it's continuing to believe in that. It might not be in the short term, where I think there's a lot of paralysis around what's happening within the AI space. But I think if you build in a long-term vision, then I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be investing in the UK.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me.